Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner again, back with my second show of the evening. And this time we're talking about what I call the Manchin energy plan, since we've been waiting for President Manchin to decide what he's going to do all year. With me to discuss this plan are Brett Hartl, who is the Government Affairs Director for the Center for Biological Diversity, which is an organization that I first learned about back in 2012 in California when I started fighting fracking. They were very instrumental in starting Californians Against Fracking, and they are one of the least sold out big green groups. So welcome, Brett.
Thanks for having me.
And next we have Branko Marcetic, who is a staff writer for Jacobin, and he is also the author of the book Yesterday's Man, The Case Against Joe Biden. And he was on my show in, I guess it was January of 2019, to talk about that book right before he won the nomination. At that point, we were very skeptical about whether he would, since he was doing so poorly. And then Branko's been on, he was on prior and subsequently, so he's probably my biggest return guest. Yay, Branko.
Well,
anyway.
I was glad to be back here.
Yeah, thank you so much. I always appreciate your willingness to come on, and I thought your take on the plan was really good. So before we talk about the climate aspects of the plan, before we talk about the plan period, Branko, I wanted to ask you, this is one of the biggest surprises that happened in Washington, D.C. I mean, literally nobody knew that this was happening. There were no leaks. What do you make of that?
I mean, I guess you have to give some credit to Chuck Schumer. It seems like he played this one pretty close to the chest. Didn't really let anyone know about it. Seemed to have kind of pulled a fast one on Mitch McConnell as well to get it through. So, I think the Democrats in general have been more disciplined than, say, the Republicans under Trump were, when you were just getting constant leaks all over the place for 4 years. Whereas, under Biden, they've kept a pretty tight lid on things. And I think this is kind of an outcome of that. But I think also clearly there was a need for secrecy, given the fact that, that they had the vote on the CHIPS Act, which the Democrats obviously didn't want to jeopardize or make McConnell kind of turn against them. So I think for that reason, you got this surprise last week.
Yeah, and it was really interesting because McConnell wouldn't give any comment on it. He was so pissed. But then what did the Republicans do? They go and they vote against this bill to provide health care to veterans, which they had previously supported. So how disgusting is that? Anyway, rhetorical question. Talk about what you think worked to move Manchin. I mean, Dave Dayen said it was a great combination of the inside-outside strategy. I was beginning to think that the activists, rowing over to his houseboat there and calling him a criminal was starting to become counterproductive. There was an article I read, I think it might have been Politico, where they talked about how Chris Coons and Tom Carper and John Hickenlooper all spoke to him. And basically they said, you don't want to be the one that is responsible for, killing the planet, Joe. And what do you think moved him the most?
I think there's probably several different things going on. I think it seems like there was some good old-fashioned interpersonal flattery. There was this piece in the Washington Post that talked about how Chris Coons kind of tried to, butter Manchin up a little bit and say, hey, no one expects you to do this, but if you do, you would save Biden's agenda and, you would look like the hero. And that seems to have worked to some extent. I think also, Dayen is correct that the pressure and the criticism that he's gotten clearly shifted his views somewhat, which I think, you look at the way that the party really pressured him and just really went in on him the past, few months compared to the much softer strategy that they took last year. The White House said, they don't want to pressure Manchin. They don't want to kind of turn him off by being too confrontational with him. Everyone, or a lot of people at least, certainly on my side of the political spectrum, thought that was a mistake. And I think this shows that it probably was, putting a little bit of pressure on him, lighting a fire on him, did actually get into the table. I think beyond that, though, we also have to think about the fact that the climate bill would, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, in greater detail soon, but it's a massive bribe, not just to Manchin personally, but to the entire fossil fuel industry. The only way they were able to get this historic investment in clean energy was to pair it with a massive giveaway to fossil fuel interests. And part of that was this agreement that they struck that after this bill passes, sometime before September, in the next bill, they will do permitting reform to basically make it easier and quicker to get fossil fuel infrastructure approved. And part of that is related to Manchin. There's a pipeline in West Virginia that I think Manchin is quite keen to get done. So, there's some of the interpersonal stuff, of course, we shouldn't discount that, but also we should be aware that this was a massive bribe to fossil fuel interests as well.
Yeah, well, we are going to discuss that. That is the major portion of our show. If Brett doesn't lose his light. Do you have any external light in that room? There, looks a little.
I have a little. It's actually, I'm far enough north that it should be light out till about 9:30, so I should be okay.
One happy. Is this your good side or this side?
Well, it's really tough. I tried a lot of different angles. This is the best I could do. I apologize for that.
All right. Well, we can still see you. I can still see you. Before we talk about the climate provision of the bills, one more question for you, Branko, because there's a lot of stuff in this. This is the big, I see it as mostly a climate bill, but let's not forget, this is what's left of the Build Back Better bill. They're calling it the Inflation Reduction Act, and there's all sorts of other things in there. I wonder if you could just talk about what elements from Biden's original plan remain and what got cut. And sort of the numbers, if you will, because the Build Back Better, I forget the total figure. I only have committed to memory how much was for climate, but it was a much bigger bill than this. So can you just talk about the other provisions having to do with, taxes and Medicare and, not Medicare, affordable care, all the other provisions?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's gone. Most of it is gone. There's no universal pre-K, childcare. Medicare is not going to be covering dental and hearing, and the Medicare eligibility age is not going to get lowered. So, I mean, most of it's gone. I don't believe that there is a higher corporate tax. I think there's a minimum corporate tax now that's been put in. But basically the Trump tax cuts are staying where they are. I guess the biggest thing that is in there is that Medicare is going to be able to negotiate certain drug prices. So that's good. But I mean, when you consider how much was in the original bill, it's pretty thin stuff. I mean, obviously, any of this stuff is welcome, and we should be happy that it could potentially pass. But when you think about the concept of the Green New Deal, the idea was that at the same time as you're doing, pretty economically disruptive stuff, displacing potentially the whole industries, the idea was that you would pair that with a comprehensive kind of safety net to keep people economically protected as that process goes on, to ensure that concept of a just transition. That wasn't quite what was going to happen in that original Build Back Better bill, but it was kind of a preview or a mini version of what that might look like if it was pursued seriously. This bill, unfortunately, is not even that. So unfortunately, we're seeing kind of more of a slapdash transition where a lot of people are not going to see the kind of economic benefits or economic security protected at the same time as we're hopefully transitioning away from fossil fuels, and that's for now not that big of a deal, but I think if you want to keep that coalition or keep a coalition together that supports these efforts, you really have to pair those two things, both the climate aspect and the kind of economic and social justice aspect.
Well, I think they are extending, the subsidies for the Affordable Care Act another 2 years. That'll help people. And they are ending the carried interest loophole, or they're making the threshold higher. They have to hold it for longer before they can call it a capital gain. And there is also some reform, more tax audits. Hopefully they won't be tax auditing. There are some things. I'll put in an article that some.
Although, well, let me just add. I mean, one, a lot of those are kind of to satisfy Joe Manchin's concerns about spending, and also, I mean, this bill is being sold as a deficit reduction bill as well. So, I mean, all those things are good, but they're not so much motivated by ensuring the kind of transformative change in the American political economy that I think the original bill at least was kind of gesturing towards. It's more just about making sure that it's deficit neutral. Well, not just deficit neutral, but actually
it's supposed to be inflation fighting. But we could do a whole show on that. The Fed raising interest rates, trying to cause a recession, trying to depress wages. The only good thing that's come out of the pandemic is working people can make a little bit more now. And now they're trying to kill that. And it's not even going to affect the two biggest drivers of inflation, which is food and gas, mostly caused by the war. But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to get into the climate part now. And I got a question for you, Brett. And this has to do with comparing the original. We're just going to show scale-wise how far we've come down. So during the election, Bernie Sanders allocated the most money to address catastrophic climate change, $16 trillion over 10 years, which he said would create 20 million new jobs. Biden's was significantly smaller. It was 1.7 trillion, saying it would only create 10 million new jobs. Bernie wanted to get transportation and electricity 100% fossil free by 2030 and the rest by 2050. In contrast, Biden wanted to get to net zero by 2050, which means we still could be using carbon capture and these other technologies that involve burning fossil fuels. So the Sunrise Movement gave Bernie 95% score and Biden only a 35% score. So now fast forward to Biden getting elected and proposing this Build Back Better plan that Branko was just talking about. That had in there $555 billion to deal with climate, whereas this plan only has $369 billion. How do the plans differ, specifically relating to climate, Brett? Can you talk about what was kept in and what was kept out? Let's not talk about, the new stuff, the poison pills that you referred to in your press release. We'll save that for a later question.
Sure. And I think it's also important for context that, as you noted, that all of these plans are over 10-year periods, right? So, this is an investment over time. And Bernie's plan, although people said, it was too much money, when you actually looked at the dollars per year, it was only 1.6 trillion. I say only, I mean, recognizing that the federal government in a given year spends about 4 trillion. It would have been a sizable investment, but it was not, it was appropriate to the scale of the crisis we're in. And if you look at the original Build Back Better proposal from last year, which was 550 billion, the things that were in it that were more substantial, it was really sort of across the board. But I think the biggest one was just the amount of money dedicated to clean renewable energy was much, much larger. Original proposals considered things like direct payments to utilities, which would have been much more action focused as opposed to just a tax credit. Tax credits can motivate human behavior if people choose to take them, but not every utility will opt to take a tax credit. They might just continue status quo. So the size of the bill basically shrunk across the board. There was far more money for transportation, rail, mass transit, or getting people out of cars. That's been radically slashed. There was a lot of money available for environmental justice. I think Build Back Better had something like 160 billion for environmental justice. That's been pared back to 60 billion. There was also actually a great deal of money set aside in the original bill for natural climate change mitigation strategies. So a much more comprehensive ecological restoration effort across the board. That's been pared down to almost nothing, just some money for farming, which is positive. Farming obviously contributes greatly to emissions, but we were looking at a much more holistic approach to climate change adaptation and mitigation. And so all of the strategies that were in the original bill have either, some of them have been cast aside completely or just drastically shrunk in size and scope. So that's sort of the big picture before we get to what new things have shown up.
Yes. Now, you talk about shrunken down. Peter Kalmus, who is a climate scientist from California, he tweets out at Climate Human. He had a thread in which he compared he showed what percentage each item in this plan was of the military budget. And I'm not going to go through that. Maybe I'll put a link to the thread in the comments. But overall, he was just saying that this plan spends $389 billion over 10 years versus the military budget, which is $800 billion every year. So right there, and we also know that the military is a huge contributor to global emissions. So now, you said, you wrote an article, Branko and Jacobin, saying it's not very good, but it's all we've got. Or I forget the actual title of your article. Wait a second. It was the Biden-Manchin climate bill isn't very good, but it's all we've got. Yeah. So why don't you talk about the good stuff that you think is in there? And then I'm going to go back to Brett to talk about the bad stuff, because his article basically said that the poison pills buried in this Inflation Reduction Act will destroy the livable climate. So those are pretty serious charges. But let's have you talk about what you see as good in here.
Well, I just spoke to different environmental groups, people who pay attention to this stuff and know what they're talking about a lot more than me. And I wanted to get their sense of it. And I mean, the consensus basically was, this is a historic sum that's being invested in shoring up the clean energy sector. Of course, that's not saying much because the US hasn't really invested a whole lot in previous years. So, almost anything could have cleared that bar. But still, it's a lot of money. And that's a big thing. I mean, it's market solutions are not going to be the thing that solves the climate crisis. However, given the very limited options that exist right now because of the political situation in the US, it's not the worst in the world for the government to subsidize and invest in clean energy and hopefully make that sector a lot bigger and more productive and ultimately the first port of call when it comes to how we power our electricity grid, how we travel around the country, all this stuff. I mean, it's already happening that wind and solar are cheaper than fossil fuels. Hopefully, this kind of accelerates that and makes that price difference even starker, so that the market can choose to go with clean renewable energy more often. But like I said, that's not going to be the solution to this crisis. I mean, we can't rely on the market to hopefully fix this. I think given what we're looking at, it's probably in the short term not a bad thing. But yeah, as Brett is going to talk about, I mean, when you factor in all the emissions that are going to come from expanding fossil fuel infrastructure, as well as the massive oil and gas lease giveaways that it mandates. If that's not curbed at some point down the line, a lot of this stuff isn't really going to matter. It's not going to matter, that people are able to buy electric vehicles for a lot cheaper, for instance. So, if there's just endless wells out there just leaking methane for years and years and years.
Yeah, I think that's key. That is really key. And, it sounds hyperbolic to say that the plan will destroy the livable climate, but you have to think about the latest IPCC report, which says that fossil fuel expansion and new fossil fuel infrastructure needs to end between 2020 and 2025, which is essentially now, to preserve a decent chance of staying under 2 degrees centigrade of mean global heating. So clearly this is not going to do it. Brett, maybe you could talk a little bit more in detail about some of the good, because you are an environmental organization. You talk about some of the good stuff, and then let's get into the drilling and the permit reform. Every time I hear the word reform, I know that's not a good thing. It's one of those Orwellian terms.
Yeah. No, I think, again, I don't think anyone in any environmental group opposes the fact that there is substantial funding available for renewable energy in this bill. There are hundreds of billions of dollars over 10 years. That's positive. If we would want much more if we were writing the legislation. But I think it's also important to recognize that of that $370 billion number that's thrown around, that's actually not all going to renewable and clean energy anymore. It's going to be a subset. There's large amounts of money and a massive increase in tax credits available for carbon sequestration, carbon capture, which basically is another lifeline to coal and gas and fossil fuel based industries. There's money being given to nuclear, which is obviously emissions free, but has all sorts of horrible other impacts. There's money for hydrogen, which is seen as a solution, although it really has not panned out yet, as another way of creating energy, ideally through using renewables to create blue hydrogen, which is in theory clean, but has not really happened yet. There's money for biomass and biofuel expansion, which is another very tricky area that can be very harmful. So the actual funds, the percentage, it's a little bit hard to figure out the exact breakdown. It's the majority going to renewable energy, but it's not everything in that pot. So 370 billion, maybe we're getting 300, 325, which again is positive, but it's extended out over 10 years. So it represents roughly about 4% of what we spend on the Pentagon in a given year, which again is better than zero. We're starting at a baseline of having done almost nothing on the climate crisis. This is better than nothing. And it may very well motivate many utilities to truly make the transition. And I think we hope we are wrong. I hope that I am wrong. I hope that this is the transformational thing that the proponents of this legislation seem to suggest. But it's hard looking at the numbers and the projections to see that comes true. And I know we'll talk about this more in detail, but I think your point about fossil fuel investment is really key here. Reconciliation bills like this one, they have 10-year horizons, and we are effectively ensuring that there will be more fossil fuel infrastructure, more fossil fuel drilling and extraction, not only past 2025, but to 2032 or 2033 at a minimum. And once some of these things come online, pipelines like Mountain Valley Pipeline and others, they have 20, 30, 40-year lifespans. We're locking in potentially a massive amount of fossil fuel infrastructure and hoping that somehow we're going to shift away from it at the same time. They are somewhat hard to reconcile those two realities. Like if we lock in fossil fuel infrastructure, it will be used. And whether or not we make sufficient shifts away from fossil fuels at the same time, seems unlikely. That's generally why the IPCC has called for this end to fossil fuel investing. It's why the UN Secretary General has said that we basically need to stop building out fossil fuels immediately, like tomorrow. And frankly, we're the only country in the developed world that solution to the climate crisis is more fossil fuels. Every other nation, I think, has a much more sophisticated recognition that they really need to start transitioning unequivocally a way. Yes, the war in Ukraine has thrown things off for the short term, but they're not trying to extend the life of all of these fossil fuel things for another several decades. So, there is good in there, and hopefully it does move the needle, but we are creating enormous hindrances to achieving the goal that we are trying to achieve.
Well, talk about this, the fossil fuels on the public lands that Biden actually ran on saying he wouldn't do. And even before this thing came out, he wouldn't stop doing that, giving leases on public lands. They sort of hold the renewables hostage to this process. Talk about how that's going to work in the bill.
Yeah, this is probably the worst poison pill in there. And just to take a step back, I think one of the most notable things, at least in my mind, that came out of the 2020 Democratic primaries, every single major candidate, from Bernie Sanders to Joe Biden to Amy Klobuchar to Tom Steyer and Michael Bloomberg, every single one of them promised that they would end new fossil fuel leasing, oil and gas leasing, onshore and offshore, as part of their campaign pledge. Obviously, Bernie had far greater ambition than Joe Biden comparatively, but every single one of them agreed that at a minimum, we would stop additional leasing on public lands owned by everyone in the United States and offshore waters, because it was so critical to starting to get a handle on the climate crisis. And this bill contains basically, it creates a hostage situation for renewable energy to be deployed on public lands and public water. So offshore wind, onshore wind, solar power in the Southwest on public lands where there's abundant sunshine, and basically says that the federal government cannot install a single wind facility or solar facility unless every single year for the next 10 years, there are certain minimum amounts of land and water leased for oil and gas. So onshore, it's 2 million acres, which is the size of Yellowstone National Park, every year have to be leased to oil and gas. And offshore, it's 60 million acres a year have to be leased for oil and gas in order to do offshore wind. So it's like this contingent thing where no renewable energy can occur unless we continuously over 10 years keep on leasing on public lands. 60 million acres a year times 10 years is 600 million acres of offshore waters being leased. The Gulf of Mexico, our share of it is only 180 million acres. So we have to lease the Gulf 4 times over in order to meet this particular target. So again, it creates this sort of one step forward, 2 steps backwards dynamic where every time we want to do renewables on public lands, we have to make sure that we are adequately giving more and more to the fossil fuel industry to destroy those same public lands. This is a terrible policy idea. It is incompatible, we think, with achieving a 1.5 degrees Celsius target, because many of these leases, especially offshore, can go on for decades. So we're just opening the spigot even wider on fossil fuels when we need to be going the opposite direction. And it's a huge blow, frankly, to Biden's own campaign promises and Biden's official policy as president that he would end new leasing. So that's probably the worst provision in this bill.
Now, talk about the permitting reform, because it seems like to me it's permanent, it's expediting these things. That's what they mean by reform. And we know that Obama, who quadrupled fracking, not Texas oilman George W. Bush, but Barack Obama quadrupled fracking. And he had this all of the above energy strategy. He licensed the first nuclear plants in this country in 30 years. He was poised to start drilling off the Atlantic, breaking the 30-year ban. And then the Gulf Horizon thing, Deepwater Horizon thing happened. So, and when he was pushing the TPP, that would have expedited LNG export terminals, which now, I fought the TPP because that would have put fracking on steroids. Because right now you can't use it, so you flare the methane if you can't use it on site. But if you could liquefy it and send it to the coast to export, which is, what they're doing now. They canceled the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, where, Europe was going to be 80% dependent on Russia. We couldn't have that. So now we've got them, and we're ramping up now, and which is even prior to this bill would have, been very bad for fossil fuel extraction. So what is this permitting reform? Talk about that a little bit.
Right. So what we know in the announcement of the agreement on this bill, Senator Manchin stated that he had a commitment from Majority Leader Schumer and Speaker Pelosi that in September they would bring some unknown permitting reform legislation and attach it to a must-pass bill. So there are a few bills every year that have to pass Congress in order to basically keep the lights on. They create impossible situations where members basically have to vote for them. That Joe Manchin was going to get some additional thing on permitting reform, and no one knows exactly what it is, what it's going to do to our core environmental laws, how it will play out in the real world. But Joe Manchin is only motivated basically by the fossil fuel industry. He has been complaining about the lack of approval of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, which would bring, like you say, fossil fuels from Appalachia to the coast. Much of it will potentially be exported in the future. He's been complaining about the fact that this pipeline has failed to get approval, in large part because the federal government has done an atrocious job analyzing the environmental impacts, which are quite significant and profound. And the federal courts have, I think, 3 times now ruled that this pipeline is not up to environmental standards and the environmental reviews have to be redone. So permitting reform is code for weakening environmental laws, and it's clear that Manchin's focus is solely on expediting and streamlining, sort of grease the skids for the fossil fuel infrastructure side. It's true that in theory, this may also benefit renewable energy projects to get them approved faster, although generally renewable energy doesn't have the same risk profile and is not as hard to approve. So there's sort of this obvious fact that is lost in all of these debates, that the reason fossil fuel projects are more challenging to approve is because they can do things like cause a Deepwater Horizon oil spill, or explode in people's neighborhoods and poison the air and poison the water. So there are very good reasons for having a rigorous environmental review to protect communities. This gentleman's handshake agreement, whatever they're going to call it, basically is just an unnecessary freebie for Joe Manchin to do whatever he wants to our environmental laws, which again brings back the point that this package that was passed or will be passed soon, whatever good things are in it are being negated by the very actions of the people passing it. Permitting reform is just a euphemism for more fossil fuel infrastructure. It's just going to make it harder to get off of fossil fuels if we keep approving more and more infrastructure with less and less regard for the environment. So it's extremely worrying. We don't have any details other than we know it's coming. But it's really going to be a difficult setback for efforts to address the climate crisis.
And can you just talk for a minute about how this disproportionately affects low-income communities of color and indigenous peoples, specifically in the areas of the Gulf, Alaska, and Appalachia, which is where I'm now living?
Yeah. I mean, we don't drill off, San Francisco for oil. We don't drill, off Long Island Sound in New York, where, Pelosi and Schumer are from. We have always historically concentrated our fossil fuel extraction activities in areas where the populations are poorer, usually Black, brown, or indigenous, and we let them suffer the impacts. I mean, the Deepwater Horizon is one of many, many horrible impacts of the fossil fuel industry. I mean, there are countless small oil spills every year in the Gulf. They just don't get noticed because they're just sort of the cost of doing business. So, air quality is lower where there's fossil fuel infrastructure and refineries. Cancer Alley in Louisiana is a great example of this. We extract from the Gulf, so all of the refining and processing and development of fossil fuels occurs in the Gulf, and it's usually sited in areas that are poor and Black or brown. in Alaska, almost all the oil and gas development is occurring in areas, that harm indigenous people. It's actually true in the West too. I mean, there are always efforts to drill in areas where, Native people are. We saw this around Chaco Canyon in Colorado, the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in Montana, because everyone knows that drilling for oil and gas and extracting coal are highly polluting activities, and they increase cancer rates, they shorten people's lifespans, and it's always them that have to bear the burden. So as we have this 10-year basically promise of more oil and gas development all the way to 2032, 2033, it's mostly going to happen in the Gulf. It's mostly going to happen in places where people don't have a voice, and that voice is going to be silenced even more because of this permitting reform. So it's tremendously harmful to environmental justice efforts to reconcile our past activities and to move forward in a better way. It's deeply cynical, and it's a travesty, frankly. It's just we need to reckon with this now and not just allow business as usual to happen for another 10 years.
Absolutely. Now, Branko, what do you think the chances of this thing getting passed are? We have to get it through the parliamentarian, of course, and then there's Gottheimer and his little caucus there that, they want to have the salt tax eliminated, and the salt tax is not eliminated. But I think the biggest obstacle may be Kristen Sinema, because Joe Manchin seems to be adamant about this carried interest loophole that he's closing. And that's her big issue, of course, because she takes a lot of money from private equity and hedge funds. So what do you think the chances of this thing passing are, if you had to give it a percentage?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to do odds for this. There's so many variables and things that could go wrong. I mean, look, I think the fact that they got Manchin on board shows that there is some awareness, even within the kind of more conservative parts of the party, that the fact that Biden's agenda was basically stalled, and he hasn't had a whole lot to show for his presidency the past year or so, is obviously bad for him, but it's also bad for the party as a whole. And the fact that they got him on board shows that maybe some of these holdouts are able to be persuaded. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, at the same time, the fact that there's such narrow margins, it gives really almost anyone a veto point over the bill. So you're right, Sinema's a problem. I think Menendez is also a problem. And then there's also, many other quieter members of Congress who may have various issues with this bill and others. But, usually just like kind of Manchin and Sinema and some of these other more high profile people take all the heat, even as they quietly, maybe don't support everything. So I don't want to put any odds on it because it's impossible to say. It sounds like they're going to really try and ram this through this coming week. So we're going to find out pretty soon, I think, whether they're, whether basically Biden's agenda can be at least somewhat salvaged.
And Brett, Amy Westerveld, I don't know if you follow her. She does a podcast called Drilled. She put a question out on Twitter yesterday that I thought it was provocative. So I said that I would ask you guys. She said, could Biden accomplish most of the good things in the Inflation Reduction Act without taking on the fossil fuel handouts if he declared a climate emergency, or do both and use executive power to rein in the handouts? Then she writes, I know, SCOTUS, but is there some leverage there? So I guess the question is, policy-wise, do you think that declaring a climate emergency, once this thing is passed, would enable him to say, okay, we can't do any more fossil fuel extraction. We have to keep it in the ground. So do you think that policy-wise that could be done, forgetting about the Supreme Court? And Branko, Biden, what do you think the chances of him doing that are? I mean, he wouldn't even declare a climate emergency now, with Europe being over 100 degrees and, 25 cities experiencing severe heat emergencies in our country because he's worried about gas prices before the midterms.
Do you want to start with me or Branko?
Yeah, let's start with you. Policy-wise, do you think that this could do it?
Well, the way we've always looked at it, we wanted President Biden to declare a climate emergency on January 22nd of last year, because we are in a climate emergency. I mean, every day there's a new horror story that shows that this is truly an emergency for us and people around the world. And it does unlock additional powers that the president has to address not only fossil fuels, but to accelerate renewable energy. There are trade provisions that can help put pressure on bad actor countries like Brazil that are destroying the Amazon. The climate emergency under the National Emergencies Act does have substantive teeth that could be very helpful. And I think our greatest disappointment from a policy perspective has been the choice by the Biden administration during the last 16 months to sort of say, well, we'll wait on executive action until we see how Congress plays out. And we've always argued that it should be yes and, not either or. You could do strong executive action from the get-go, which might have actually put more pressure on Congress to act with more urgency so they wouldn't feel like they were losing their chance to develop climate policy. So we think, it is all of the above, in the sense it's a terrible phrase, but the president should be using all of his executive power. The federal agencies should be pushing as hard as possible, partly because even the analysts that like this Inflation Reduction Act legislation, they say that we're only going to get to about a 41% reduction in CO2 best case scenario, which is not 50 or 52. And 50 or 52% reduction, which is what we've pledged under the Paris Accords, is also probably not enough to really give us a good chance of stopping the climate crisis. So we're short. Even if everything comes to pass and works out perfectly with this bill, we're still at least 10 to 15% below where we need to be, and probably more. So from a policy perspective, I think the case should be clear that we should do everything we can. But I would just say, if this bill passes, it does limit the president then can't just say, well, we won't do the fossil fuel stuff. Like, he's basically being forced into it. They're not going to walk away from deploying renewables on public lands. So we're going to see more oil and gas drilling, and several Gulf lease sales, giant lease sales from the Trump years, although actually approved originally by Obama, they would go forward too, which would lock in more fossil fuel infrastructure. So, he can't undo that act of Congress through executive power. Like, he has to work within the confines of the law, but he still has tremendous opportunities, tremendous powers. The federal agencies like EPA could be doing a great deal more. And what I also do worry about actually is a lack of, now that we're going to pass this bill, everyone's going to sort of, pull a George W. Bush and declare mission accomplished, and we're going to lose that urgency again. And he's not going to declare a climate emergency, and the EPA isn't going to act with urgency because they're going to say, well, look, we've done this great thing, so we don't have to worry as much. And I think that's just a tremendously foolish approach, and I hope I'm not right about that.
And Branko, what do you think? Ideologically, I don't see his climate ever being an issue, prior to this presidential election with this man. I think he's probably more concerned about labor, for example. He's doing stuff on antitrust, which is great. But I don't really see him as the climate leader that we need. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I have the same concern as Brett. I feel like with this bill potentially going through, and not just that, but the way that it's being talked about, I mean, quite understandably, I think people want to create momentum for the bill to pass, and so they're really talking it up and making it seem like, as Brett said, kind of mission accomplished to some extent. And so if it passes, I think there's going to be, I worry that there's going to be a sense that, okay, well, we've done this, we managed to do this thing that had eluded us for a year, and now there's all this climate funding in place, and we don't have to worry anymore about doing all this kind of more radical executive stuff. And for Biden, that's very tempting. Biden is above all an institutionalist. He believes in all these kind of norms, and he believes in American institutions. He doesn't believe in using executive power in kind of unique ways. I think he has been driven towards it in some instances, but he's been. I mean, if you look at most of the executive orders he's given out, they haven't really pushed the boundaries too much. They've been fairly conventional. So, and he's previously said that he doesn't want to use executive orders and sort of to degrade, or at least in his view, degrade democratic action and the way that kind of the political process is meant to work. So, yeah, I think it is going to be tempting for him to not do anything after this, but that I think really only further puts the onus on climate activists and journalists and ordinary people to put pressure on the Biden administration to keep following on in this and go forward, go further. I think we shouldn't frame this as kind of the end of the road, but really it's just the beginning of a much bigger fight. As Brett says, it's going to be a huge battle to keep all these fossil fuels in the ground that the bill is basically going to activate.
Well, my last question is about exactly what activists should be doing, and I want to read this quote also from Amy Westerveld because I thought it was really apt, and it speaks to the emergency that we're in. Politicians are still treating climate change like, well, politics. In doing so, they're missing the one really key difference between this issue and every other issue they might address: time. If Washington fucks up on healthcare, people will die, it's true, but we're not locked into mass death year over year, compounding and increasing all the time with no way to stop it. A new policy could literally stop the bleeding from one day to the next. The same is not true of climate. Compromise today may well be smart politics, but it is also genocide. It is a choice to put corporate profits over human life, and not just the humans walking around right now, but also those who will walk the earth 50 years from now. It's the sort of thing that makes me wonder all the time whether politics is just fundamentally incapable of meeting this challenge. So I'm like, you think? I spoke I gave a 3-minute public comment the other night at the North Carolina Utilities Commission. There had 4 hearings around the state to deal with North Carolina's carbon reduction plan, which, strangely enough, they asked Duke Energy to write. And it got a failing grade by the North Carolina Fossil Fuel Coalition. And, when I spoke, I said that I'm a climate refugee. I literally moved from Los Angeles because in 2019, I had to pack up my house twice to potentially evacuate because the fires in the Santa Monica Mountains were that close. Fortunately, I didn't. But, now we know that California is undergoing extreme drought and the water sources are literally drying up. And North Carolina seems to be a better place to be, but no place is really safe. And, she talks about those who will walk the earth 50 years from now. I told my children, who are now 25 and 29, not to have kids a number of years ago, because I, really don't think that we have the political will to do what it takes, to stop this thing. And I feel like life is going to be extremely inhospitable at best, if not uninhabitable, in 50 years. So my question is, what do you think activists should be doing? Should we go back to the tactics of the tar sands blockade people who were literally chaining themselves to the bulldozers? I mean, Brett, you were part of that action in DC where people got arrested every day outside of the White House. And it didn't make a difference. It's like everybody's protesting everything every day. So that kind of thing doesn't work. You remember the valve turners. They went up and at 5 different points along the Canadian US-Canada border, they literally turned off the spigots. And then they called the pipeline company and said, you might want to turn your pipeline off because we just stopped the oil from coming through. And then they called the cops and waited to be arrested. And when I heard them speak at a forum in Los Angeles, I started crying because I thought, these people, they wrote their congressmen, they testified, they signed petitions, they wrote letters to the editor, they did everything that we're supposed to do as citizens, and yet nothing worked. And they were willing to spend the rest of their lives in jail. And that's why they did this. So I know this is like a really crucial question to put on the two of you, but I mean, what do you think we should be doing right now?
Well, it's a tough moment, and it's a tough moment. I think also in part because it sucks to be the downer in the group that's saying, well, this is not enough. But like you say, we are out of time. I mean, this was the last decade to act, and we're not acting sufficiently in this country. And a lot of folks are going to think we are because of this bill, and the fight against fossil fuels actually is more urgent now than it was yesterday, and it's going to continue to be that way. And there's a variety of tactics, and obviously every organization and person has to make their own choice. So it's hard to say there's one thing for everyone, but I mean, we are going to fight. First of all, we're going to fight this horrible bill to the death, and if and when it passes, we are going to fight every lease and every single project that Joe Manchin has tried to accelerate, and use every guerrilla warfare tactic we can in the courts, outside of the courts, civil disobedience when necessary to fight it, because we have to still try to hold that line. I don't like just relying on education to say we need to convince people that we still need to do more. I suspect people will realize within a year or two that this wasn't enough, and hopefully that'll reinvigorate. But it's going to be hard because a lot of folks are going to be demotivated because they're going to declare victory with this. And I certainly hope I'm wrong. I mean, I hope this bill does more than it promises, but I don't think I am, and I don't think that really a clear analysis shows that it is going to do enough. And I don't want to speak completely out of sort of my realm of expertise, but I'm always struck, at least from a hopeful note, that like other countries seem to be getting it more than we are, and that gives me hope. I mean, this country does seem rather dysfunctional and just in a terrible trajectory, and it has been that way for many years. And it is hard, honestly, to see the pathway out, the thing that turns it around here. It's a tough time. I mean, it's been tough for a very long time. I mean, not since Trump. I mean, the Bush years, we have not been going in a good direction, but other countries do seem to get it. I mean, even Boris Johnson, who's like this horrible conservative person in Britain, like had a way more ambitious climate plan than like everybody in the US, except maybe Bernie and Warren. And other countries are moving in a better place, and maybe will eventually stop being laggards. But it is tough. And, I don't want to sugarcoat that. I mean, this is the most dire situation our civilization has been in, and it's just getting worse. So but we just have to, I mean, all I can do is say, we're just going to fight.
Yeah.
We're not going to give him an inch. We're not going to give him a quarter. Like, we're going to try to fight every single one of these ridiculous projects till the very last. And that's what I'll be doing. And that's what my organization will be doing.
Yeah, I want to say to people watching, please give to the Center for Biological Diversity, because they're on the front lines. They're always challenging these things in court. They're the first to sue. Them and Earth Justice and Food and Water Watch and Friends of the Earth. They're my favorite environmental organizations. And you can give to them, and your money is going to be used wisely. So Branko, I'm going to give you the last word on this very existential topic. What do you think we should be doing?
Well, I mean, we should throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. I mean, everything. There should be action in the streets. There needs to be concerted action, among unions and workers. There needs to be the legal avenues. There should be people. As far as I'm concerned, I'm totally fine with people following, Congress people into the bathroom or the restaurant or wherever they're going and pressure make their lives, as uncomfortable as possible, because this is how important this issue is. I mean, I think it would be wonderful to see something like what we saw in 2020 about the issue of police violence, but for the climate. It's something major and massive and disruptive like that to really highlight the seriousness of the problem. I mean, unfortunately, you can't really coordinate those things. The 2020 protests were spontaneous outbursts of anger and frustration because of years of an issue being unaddressed. Climate doesn't have quite that salience yet. But these disasters are getting worse and worse and more common, and so I think as the years go by, people are going to start to feel the effects of climate change a lot more, and hopefully that translates into more kind of popular anger, into more protest activity, more organizing. I think as well, we have to look at the climate crisis and the inability to respond to it as part of a broader political crisis in the United States, but not just in the US, really across the world, where basically our governments, to different degrees in the US, it's a lot more extreme than other places, but really have been captured by big business, captured by neoliberal ideology that basically makes them unable to stand up to these interests and to properly to do what needs to be done. So in the US, I would say, look, support organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America. That the few people that they have gotten elected to public office at the federal level have been important, really important. Not just having those people in Congress, but putting the fear into incumbents that if they are not sufficiently progressive or aggressive, really, on tackling things like the climate crisis and other issues, that they also could be thrown out of office. So we have to do that. We have to support those candidates. Any candidate who is willing and actually can prove that they are willing to stand up to fossil fuel interests and to push this stuff. But also, we have to support as much as we can the organization of workers across the country. We're seeing this kind of uptick in labor militancy that's happening here and there. It's still way too slow and pretty limited. But the more that organizing happens, and the more political education that there is for workers, that's part of what I do at Jacobin, and what other kind of left-wing publications try and do, to give workers that political education so that they see themselves as not just atomized workers working for their own, discrete interests, but as part of something bigger. I'd remind people what happened during a government shutdown, whenever it was, 2018, 2019, and how quickly Trump folded when the flight attendants threatened to strike, which would have been very disruptive. That shows you the power that workers have, when they're actually able to be organized and kind of work as a cohesive whole. And also not just organizing, for their own benefits, which of course is essential, but seeing their organizing as part of a larger battle, a larger political battle. So if we can translate that beyond, just one instance of government shutdown, but to something much bigger, that would be great. Now that's, we're talking years from now, that's we're not nearly at that stage, but I think that's the kind of thing you got to see, that there has to be all of this stuff happening at once.
Right.
And I hope that as this issue becomes more salient in people's minds, that's where we end up going. We just have to keep pushing and pushing, and history takes some very, very strange and surprising turns, and it could happen, sometimes in an instant, it feels like. So that's what we should be kind of looking towards.
Great. I want to thank you both for being on the show. After I end it, I'm going to put your Twitter handles in the comments so people can follow you. But I'm going to let you go now so I can talk about my last show. I usually promote my next show, but I'm going to talk about my last show because I just did it before you guys. So thank you very much for talking about this very important subject.
Thanks a lot. Have a good night.
All right. So I did a show before this with Lisa Graves, who's a foremost attorney. She is the founder, executive director, editor-in-chief of True North Research. Before that, she was the executive director of the Center for Media and Democracy. She has devoted her life's work to protecting democracy, first in the Justice Department under Bill Clinton, and then as a professor at George Washington Law School. And we talked about the independent state legislature theory, which sounds like a snooze, but it's really what the Supreme Court is going to use next session to overturn even more levers of democracy than they already had. It relates to a case in North Carolina, partisan gerrymandering, that our state Supreme Court struck down, and they appealed to the US Supreme Court, and they've agreed to hear the case. And this particular theory was also used by Trump to try to steal the election in 2020, and they're working on it to try to steal the election in 2024. So this is a very important theory that this radical Supreme Court is going to probably utilize. And we talk about what it means, what other things they've done that are just so precedent breaking. They're out of control, the Supreme Court. And we close by talking about what, if anything, can be done about it. So you will find that on my Facebook page, right under this show, and you will also find it on my YouTube channel. So until my next show, thank you for watching, share the show, and keep fighting.